This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast, a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President podcasts. You'll be hearing more about this in the future, so keep your podcatchers updated. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Erik Fogg of the Reconsider podcast. Links to learn more about Erik and his podcast can be found at reconsidermedia.org or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can connect with me and other people who want to learn more about the movies they watch and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all this and much more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. Thanks for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. I am super excited to be joined again by Erik Fogg of the Reconsider podcast. The topic of the day today is the era of Elizabeth I of England, and the Elizabethan age was considered the golden age of England. And we're going to discuss some of the really interesting issues involved in Queen Elizabeth's life and times. And we're going to use the 2007 movie Elizabeth Golden Age as the frame of reference. And Elizabeth, the Golden Age, the second one, focuses in on the second part of Elizabeth's reign. And if you want to learn more about that first part, there's also a movie for that. And you can listen to an episode I did with the great Heather Tesco of the Renaissance England History podcast on the movie that was just named Elizabeth, where we really talk about that first part of Elizabeth's life and reign. And so you can find links and all that in the show notes. Now, Erik, there is so much to talk about with this movie. Where should we start?
Yeah, good question. And it's for those who love Heather's show, Renaissance English History, and loved the episode she did with Steve, which I listened to as sort of research. I'm a little intimidated. I fear I will be a pale imitator because I am not an expert of the Tudor age the way that she is. But the part of this time period that actually interests me most is sort of the geopolitics, right? So we have in the movie Elizabeth, the big climax, of course, is the Spanish Armada bearing down to destroy Elizabeth, destroy Protestantism in England, and of course the lucky or godly, depending on how you see it, wind knocks these ships to shore and they sink. And there's a step in between, which is the English go pound them into oblivion while they're up against the rocks. But I really think the most, it's a very interesting question about how England and Spain, who were tentative allies against the French, because the French were buddying up with Scotland and wanted to squeeze England. So how did the English and Spanish go from being allies against the formidable French to becoming, such profound enemies that the Spanish basically drove themselves into bankruptcy in order to try to destroy England? That's a really interesting story, and I think Elizabeth, of course, paints it as a somewhat personal but primarily. Somewhat personal as in like between Philip and Elizabeth, but primarily personal religious decision by Philip, which may even have been true for Philip, but for the nation of Spain, it was of course a much bigger deal, there were many more factors that went in.
Yeah, I think that definitely that angle of that personal animus that they had, and there is that religious element of that. One was Protestant, and really the very pragmatic step that Elizabeth took in Protestantism. She didn't go all in like a lot of the princes did in in Germany and places like that. And there was certainly sectarian violence in England, but nothing like there was in Germany. But there's still a lot of nasty and very disagreeable, very bloody too, interreligious warfare going on in the continent that just really doesn't translate into England.
Yeah, I agreed. Regarding the movie itself, there are a lot of ways that biopics always end up disappointing me, right? I've read the history and now I want to see the biopic, and it's always a big letdown. And it's just a hard part about the format. You've got 2.5 hours to try to describe half of a reign of a very, very busy monarch. She was like exploring Africa and exploring the Americas and fighting with Spain and fighting with Scotland. And one of the things that goes down in Scotland, I think it would have been contemporaneous to the first movie, not the second. But there's a Protestant Catholic throwdown of a massive variety in Scotland, in which the Protestants are overthrown and then the Catholics are overthrown. And there's essentially a highly unstable, pendulous civil war going on there that becomes Elizabeth's problem. And it is in fact astounding that, it's one thing that it doesn't come across the channel, but it's astounding that same fervor, or the same violence doesn't cross the border from Scotland, especially since England was still a very, very divided nation in terms of religious allegiance. It was not, Mary was obviously Catholic. It was not, and by the time Elizabeth got to the second half of her reign, she had done and so she passed that, and she knew, of course, that like the question wasn't settled. And so I'm rambling a little bit, but to your point, she was, for all of her strengths and flaws, one of the things that she did like that is almost superhuman was keep true civil war from springing up in England the way it was in Germany, in France, in Scotland. It's one of the things I think that leaders are often not sufficiently appreciated for, is the bad things that didn't happen during their reign, right? We love firefighters because they put fires out, but nobody loves nobody loves the inspector who goes around and makes sure that the fire alarms work, or that the little fire extinguishers are primed. But those folks save way more people. And the fact that there wasn't a civil war in England is much to Elizabeth's credit.
I think what a good place to maybe start is that Elizabeth was a woman monarch in an era that, it wasn't completely uncommon, but it was not common for a monarch to reign as long as she did. Actually, in name, that she was the queen. There were certainly women who had run the show, but who were doing it as a regent or kind of behind the shadows, or, pulling the strings. But she was a monarch in her own right, and, sparring with the big boys in town. What did you think about that?
Well, I actually, this is a place where I actually really like the way the film handled it. It's hard, it's hard to see the film objectively. And I'll share my thoughts on Elizabeth herself in a sec, but then I want to hear yours. It's hard to judge a film that is trying to portray a woman's place in the world literally 450 years ago, or 440 years ago. Because of course, the way that people treat her and the way that people talk around her and about her, you kind of think like, well, this is a little disrespectful of women. This is of course the way that, this was of course like the problem that the men around her faced, was they at once were, kind of culturally misogynistic and felt that, women, that like the Bible told, their interpretation of the Bible was that women were subservient to men, but at the same time, they were fiercely loyal to and respected the queen. My thought about it is that Elizabeth, even though she was, of course, not the first queen monarch of England, arguably it was really Mary. It wasn't poor Jane Grey, but Mary, of course, got married to the very Philip we're going to be talking about here in a moment. And there were a lot of concerns that Philip really, really pulled the strings. And this caused, of course, a lot of consternation while she was queen, and Parliament passed a bunch of bills to try to check Philip's power. As we know, Elizabeth ruled on her own all of her life. And I'm sure we're going to be talking about that. But I do think in particular, she was sufficiently powerful of personality. She was clever and quick-witted enough. She was successful enough, and in a lot of ways lucky enough, that I think the impression she left behind, and we see this later in the way that people talk about queens, it as essentially a little bit more equal to the idea of a king as opposed to kind of weird, that she left behind this taste in the mouths of the English historical zeitgeist of the 1700s that queen is totally cool. Look how great a job Elizabeth did.
I think the thing that I kept going back to and really crossed into both movies is, and I kept going back and forth on it, is the marriage issue, because she was really under the pressure of any monarch. Her dad knew that very well, that you need to have issue. Yeah. You need to have somebody to pass the throne on to. And it always came back to me okay, so maybe she could marry one of these big names in European monarchy, even who were some of the ones? The Tsar of Russia offered his hand at one point. I don't know if that was one of the ones that was a real offer. It was kind of hey, let's give this a go. But there was, I think there was the Prince of Denmark was in there at one point. And, at different points, there was the King of France, or maybe it wasn't the King of France. It might have been a really high-ranking duke.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the Duke of Bourbon or something.
Yeah, and then there was also offers of maybe lesser nobles in the kingdom of England itself. And I thought, at first I was thinking, okay, maybe it would make sense for her to marry one of these lesser nobles, that she's still obviously the power, but then she gets an heir, boom, you're done. But then there's also that kind of gets her drawn into the petty part of her internal struggles.
Yes.
She could marry one of these big names outside of the kingdom, but then you're bringing in a man who wants, presumably, especially if she married one of these princes from the Holy Roman Empire, that he's going to want to be the king of England. What did you think about that? And what do you think about her, those different things? Was that maybe the ultimate thing in the end that stalled her out?
You and I, we benefit from David Crowther covering this just now as well. So we've had both Heather's take on it over at Renaissance English History, and we're getting David's take on History of England. Both of them are superb historians. And so David's is more recent in my mind, and I found his case very compelling. That. And it's funny, you went through the exact same thought process I did, that fundamentally there were major political problems with anyone she could marry. Outside power, obviously, a lot of risk of them thinking, oh, okay, because at this time, this was before, this was pre-Waterloo. And so, yes, there was some, it was after Westphalia, at least, see Ben Jacobs, right? So, but it's after Westphalia, so there was some respect for states in and of themselves. They weren't just the personal fiefdoms of individuals, but it was before Waterloo. And so the idea of getting involved in another state and absorbing it was just a lot more, it was just cool then, right? And so, of course, someone, to your point, someone like the Tsar of Russia thinking oh, okay, I can create personal union with England, which, by the way, happened under James VI, James I anyway. So this isn't far-fetched. This idea of someone grasping for personal union, totally super scary, very dangerous. And again, with Mary having married Philip II of Spain, really hamstrung her ability to rule the country, because people, in part just because people were so afraid that that's exactly what was going on. So I think Elizabeth nixed that. And then to your point about marrying a lesser noble, what happens is you start to pick sides fundamentally in England's internal politics, and a lot of the power of the monarch was being fundamentally removed from that. And being able to, being free to pick one side or another as they saw fit and hold everyone in check. And as we saw during and part of what she probably knew was before Henry Tudor showed up, it was the very problem that was it Edward the Sixth, or I don't know, but Edward, like he was mentally incapable, and so he was held by these families. But the fact that like the monarch was so deeply tied to a family led to civil war. She probably knew this, and so she had to rule that out as well. Why isn't this a problem for a man? Well, because traditionally what happens is, it doesn't matter what family you marry the woman from, they just ship them off. Like the woman is just kind of, unfortunately, a second class citizen. They're shipped off. They have no power. And so it doesn't matter if you, as a male monarch, marry a woman from another country, a princess from another country or a daughter of a powerful noble house. Yes, you are closer to them, but there's never any suspicion that they now have power to influence what you will do. And so I think it was, I really do think it was an attempt to preserve her own autonomy, to be able to make the right decisions for England that fundamentally kept Elizabeth from ever getting married.
Yeah, I think that's the point of that. You made a great point that those families were so powerful in England. And if you picked somebody from one family over another, you're getting back into that Civil War issue. That was almost a bigger loss than just marrying somebody a random from the continent, but then like that opens its own set of Pandora's boxes. But that's a huge issue, that if she had married some lower noble, then that's raising that family's stock over some other wealthy family, which could cause major problems.
Of course, the English system of government was not designed at once the way the Americans was, right? It was, and the Americans has evolved since then, but England was always evolving. And so what it had at the time was implicitly built around the assumption that the monarch would be male. And therefore kind of put the monarch in a position where the monarch could be totally independent. You could have a misogynistic society where women are subservient to men, and the monarch is always totally independent because the monarch's always a man. And nobody had thought about either, do we change our cultural norms about women who are monarchs, or do we change the system in order to not have the monarch have to be so independent. And of course, the tragedy for Elizabeth, other than her personal tragedy as a person, right? Like not having to, like not being, like men, of course, were allowed to run around and sow wild oats before they were married anyway. Elizabeth had to be at least on record a virgin, period, or else she was hosed. So there's this personal tragedy for her. But even as a monarch, the third option, which was not get married at all, wasn't that great either. In part because it led to two things. One, a lot of anxiety over when you die, what happens. And two, it made it a lot easier for, foreign Catholics to consider offing her, because, to your point about this importance of issue, because she lacked an heir, it meant that the next person in line was Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic, and what that meant was her choice not to marry and not to have issue was not the obvious correct one. It led to the Babington plot, right? It led to, which in the movie, like you see someone try to shoot her, that never happens. Yeah. Walsingham catches it. Reason like Walsingham is running around freaking out about this all the time, as is Cecil, who is unfortunately absent from the damn movie. Which is tragic because Cecil's awesome. But these guys running around freaking out, it's not just because they may be misogynist, they may be paternalist, they may look down on her because she's a woman. As far as we can tell, they didn't. They had a lot of respect for her, but they're sitting there going, the fact that you don't have issue is dangerous to your life. It is dangerous to and is dangerous to the system that you have put in place, the religious system that you've put in place, because people know that you're like one bullet away from having a Catholic monarch.
Yeah, I think maybe a good thing is, since you brought up Walsingham, is something I was thinking a lot about that, the Spanish versus the English, and we get a lot of hindsight because we have 450 years of 2020 vision.
Yeah.
England was definitely the smaller player. I mean, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, that's like every empire you could think of, the Empire Strikes Back, like all lumped into one, really, because and maybe we can get into their economics in a few minutes, but they had almost unlimited resources to tap into.
Yes.
And really, England was starting to chip away at the edge of that. And some of the France and the others were chipping away at the edges of that. But this whole larger issue of Spain, maybe we could turn the lens around a little bit and look at England from the lens of Spain, and maybe why Philip he seemed so, I mean, tweaked against Elizabeth. It seemed like such a thorn in his side that maybe it didn't have to be. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Before I was going to jump off on a tangent, and yeah, you're right. Like from a certain perspective, to the Habsburgs, the English are small fries, right? As David likes to call them, it was a pimple on the continent's backside, right? And which can be at times painful, but is not that big a deal. And so why did the Habsburg mega empire feel like England was worth going after? And so we have to look at, of course, the geopolitical reasons and the religious reasons. If I recall correctly, England did ask for it a little bit. So England, I believe, ended up intervening in the Netherlands in a key way when the Spanish Netherlands were being kind of reconquered or put down by Philip of Spain. And so they established them, England did establish itself as one of the major Protestant players on the board. Again, there weren't a lot of big ones. There weren't a whole lot of big ones at that point. And what's interesting, of course, is so like, why is this? And I don't know if I have an answer. Someone does, but why is this Protestant Catholic religious strife popping up right now? England does get involved with the Netherlands for a couple reasons. One of them is because they want to secure shipping for their wool. So in a lot of ways, it once again comes down to money. But then the other reason is they want to defend their Protestant buddies. The English were like, they were starting to get a little Whiggish, right? Like freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, all these things are good. The Netherlanders or the Dutch, were feeling that way too. They got involved. This became potentially just a piece on the board that the Catholic or the Holy Alliance felt like they could sweep away. But then, of course, the other way I think about Philip's relationship is that, in the movie, he's just like obsessive about England all the time. And my impression is he's a little bit of a weird dude, but he's mostly just very Catholic and very papist. And I think, I have to assume that the papal bull of, this is Pius V's, Regnans in Excelsis, 1570, the papal bull that excommunicated Elizabeth and everyone who followed her orders, right? That helped tip the scales a lot, because I think in the movie, Philip's just looking for pretext to invade. Clearly not true. Clearly was allied with England beforehand against France. But I do think the papal bull saying, the pretended Queen of England and the servant of crime, we charge and command all and singular the noble subjects, peoples, and others aforesaid, that they do not dare obey her orders, mandates, and laws. Those who act to the contrary, we include in the like sentence of excommunication. The Pope Pius V is like ripping angry with Elizabeth, and maybe we should explore a little bit of why. But I do think that Philip II was such a sincere papal Catholic that he saw this, was like, wow, she's bad, right? She's really bad, and she's bad for the people of England. And I think his convictions were sincere in his decision to invade, as well as there being at least some geopolitical justification.
Yeah, I think that at that point, too, that the Ottoman Empire was really a going concern at that point. And they were probably rightly so, that they were feeling like they're being squeezed on both ends in Europe, at least, even though in a lot of ways they're expanding dramatically religiously outside of Europe. Inside of Europe, the going from east to west, the Habsburg Empire from Spain into Hungary, and that's that they have the Protestants to the north, and the Protestants don't have a huge problem with the Muslims, at least in theory, or they're willing enough to work with them. And so from the south, you have the Ottomans. It's in that a little bit after Elizabeth's reign where the last siege of Vienna happened. So that's still definitely a thing going on at that point. And so that it must have always been a concern in the Pope's mind, and probably Philip's, because it always seemed like Spain, no matter how well things were going in the New World, it was always just a way to dump more money into the things they were doing in Europe.
Yeah. It's you're right to point out that, or I think you're right to point out that part of the remilitarization of Catholicism conceptually, or something like that in Europe was driven by the Ottomans' last gasp into Europe, because the Battle of Vienna was scary, or the Siege of Vienna was scary. I mean, imagine freaking Vienna falling. And for those who love cinema, just a little trivia moment for you. When Rohan rides to the aid of Gondor in Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, and the cavalry charges down from the hills to smash the orcs, it is essentially a replay of the Polish hussars, many of whom had these big wings on their backs, this roaring noise, this ultra elite shock cavalry riding down at very much the 11th hour to break the Ottoman siege of Vienna, which was otherwise, they were like, their undermining was working and all sorts of stuff. So this is fresh in the Catholics' mind. They have remilitarized. They now have the Holy Alliance, and it's probably in a lot of ways has made them a little bit more aggressive, and I guess a little bit more like, hey, God's on our side, because we just won at Vienna, we won at Lepanto, the big sea battle, and so God's smiling on us, thumbs up, and then you do have a resurgence of a mix of Protestant and nationalist behavior, again, primarily from the Netherlands in Europe, that seems to be involved in or that seems to be a trigger for an outbreak of distrust and violence in the continent. So it's England. I think, like, I do think in hindsight, England's involvement in the Netherlands, as well as, I mean, their piracy of Spanish shipping was possibly just good policy, but their involvement in the Netherlands, like, definitely poked the bear in a big way. That may, in retrospect, may not have been necessary.
Yeah, I think that piracy, and that they get into that a little bit in the movie, which is one I don't love getting into nitpicking movies, but the fact that they didn't ascribe they had a character in there who was Sir Francis Drake in every single way, except for some reason they called him Sir Walter Raleigh.
Yes.
And I don't know why they did that, and I didn't see a very compelling reason to do that. But I think that came back to something that England had going for them, is that they were flexible and they were small enough that they were able to pivot militarily and economically, and really with their whole government apparatus, that Walsingham set up spy networks. And even if they weren't the greatest spy networks in the world, they were something that he was getting a lot of information that Spain in particular was not doing that sort of thing to gather up that sort of information. And that, I think that flexibility really is what maybe gave them the edge, the English, the edge of not getting conquered.
Maybe it is certainly the case. Sorry, I said maybe just because, like, England did not win that war or that battle, the weather did, but I mean, they had to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but it's certainly the case that Spain had a limited ability to how big a fleet they could send. And I even forget how big the Spanish Armada was. It was a lot bigger than the English fleet, but it was only so much bigger than the English fleet. And they also weren't able to follow up on the destruction of the Spanish Armada, because at that point they were broke.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, it was largely due to they're deeply committed in the Netherlands. As much as you're pumping a lot of silver out of the New World, it's expensive to maintain. And they, the Habsburg dynasty also over in Austria now has a lot of defensive military commitments, and they just burned a lot of money on the Ottoman War as well. And so England, yes, is able to be very picky and choosy about how it fights, and it largely fights kind of asymmetric warfare the whole time. I think it's also the case. I'm going to look this up, but I think it's also the case that had that wind not blown that way that day, the English would have definitely lost the naval battle.
Yeah.
And after that, look, England is hard to conquer for a lot of reasons, but it would have been fighting on English soil. And I think Elizabeth's reign likely would have ended in a very different way. What we don't know is to what extent, let's say Spanish troops land, to what extent does the Papal Bull cause the Catholics to rise up, or a number of Catholic noble houses to join the Spanish as opposed to defend England? And we're kind of used to Philip. He was married to Mary. So, things could get real bad real fast for Elizabeth if that does happen.
And I could even correct myself, is that they didn't learn too many lessons, the English, at least from the Armada, because I believe it was within a couple of decades, maybe even less than that they sent their own Armada to attack Spain using pretty much the same set of strategies and the same set of technology. And then their Armada was destroyed. So they didn't learn. I think that even in my own mind, I get a lot of confusion between the England of the 1700s and the 1600s of, this big naval power, which they really weren't quite at that point. They probably had an edge on raw talent in naval fighting with somebody like Sir Francis Drake, and probably Raleigh. I think Raleigh was more of a financier than he was a swashbuckler that they portrayed him in the movie. But they did have a certain amount of naval intrinsic knowledge, but they still just went and threw massive, basically wooden castles against the Spanish, and then that was in turn defeated, which that was really, from what I've read, the thing that hurt England in the end economically, when Elizabeth had set them up pretty nicely economically, and she had refilled the treasury to some degree and got them on a fairly stable platform after several years previous to her of not great financial stability.
Yeah. I seem to remember, probably from Heather's show as well, the same the same thing that England, by the time Elizabeth died, was actually in a bit of trouble, and it was part of why England was financial trouble, and it was part of why England was so happy to look up at James the Sixth of Scotland and say, sure, please just run it. We just can't deal right now. And the kind of, because what's interesting, of course, is that James is a fairly distant relative. He's a foreigner, and by the way, the Scots were enemies a little bit beforehand. Now that was Catholic Scotland, and James was Protestant, made life a lot easier. But even the Catholics didn't make a stink about James showing up and running both Scotland and England in personal union. Why was this? Because England was in pretty bad shape. Why was this? I think you're right. If I recall correctly, you're right, because it was broke. I'm looking at the Wikipedia article about the English Armada. Quote, "The English Armada was arguably misconceived and ended in failure overall. In the end, Elizabeth sustained a severe loss to her treasury." Then they get tied deeper into a Dutch revolt. It's a mess. And that's the hard part about being the small player, is that for Spain, it was many expenses and many epic battles and many people dead that got to the point that they were getting near pretty broke after the first Armada. The whole point of the English Armada, though, is that the Spanish were building a second one, right? It's like the second Death Star, right? It's mooring off of Endor right now, and we're going to go get it, right? So maybe this is inspiration for Star Wars, I don't know. But the English decide, yeah, we can go get it. We're going to be nimble. We're going to be clever. And then boom, they sink. And luckily for England, it's kind of like in the 10th round of a boxing match. Nobody's knocked out yet and probably won't be because everyone's exhausted. And weirdly, not weirdly, people decide to move on in part because they've got bigger fish to fry by the early to mid 60s.
I'd like to especially ask you, and it's something that I'm loath to bring up, is comparisons of history to modern times. But it seems to me with the economics of Spain that they really they always spent like there was always going to be money, because they were able to, they had kind of two things going that they could. The next treasure fleet came in that was just full of gold and silver that they were bringing from all over the world, and they could borrow almost endlessly off of that. And they always kind of acted like that the good times were always going to roll. And there were some people, I did an episode about a year ago with an economic historian who had talked about the Salamanca school of theologians. They were really, you couldn't call them even economists, but they're saying, well, maybe something doesn't quite add up here. I feel like there is this sort of idea today that, that we can print money and it's just all zeros and ones and zeros and bits. And do you feel that there's any sort of corollary here?
Ooh, that's a big topic. And I will caveat that I'm probably about as good an economist as I am a philosopher, or about as qualified as I am a philosopher. So I have to be careful. It's just enough to be dangerous, right? And so I have to be careful. That's
what we love, though.
Well, sure, yeah.
That makes it fun.
Yes. So just don't buy or sell any stocks based on my advice, and we'll be good. So regarding the Spanish, what is interesting about I love that you bring this up specifically because part of what made hard specie monetary systems fairly stable was that there was a fairly limited supply of hard specie. And so it was often more difficult to have runaway inflation unless you were debasing it, which is a little bit like finding more, except a lot worse. So the Spanish managed to find a lot more, and they have so much coming in that they're like, a single shipment is like, okay, this is our this is our budget for the year. The implications of that are, one, you can get a lot of like kind of flood, like you can cause inflation, right, which did happen, but more importantly, like if you look at kind of the Hayekian school on this, and this is where I'll tie it to the future, is you'll actually get not just inflation, but like overheating of certain markets, and like overconstruction, overdevelopment that leads to an economic collapse. So Hayek would say like it's the economic boom you should be worried about, because it's going to cause the bust. So and arguably that I don't know enough about Spain to say whether that happened or not, but it is, if you're going to be flooded with because gold's not real stuff, right? It's not labor, it's not food, it's not wood. It's just a representation. So you're flooding with that. You don't suddenly have more labor, more wood, more food. And that's kind of the principal voyage things get scary. Does the same thing happen with kind of modern printing? In a way, yes. So it's even the case that to your point about ones and zeros, most money isn't even paper money. Like the vast, vast, vast majority of money never becomes paper. So we talk about the Fed printing money. It's mostly not even that. It's called M2. It's just in computers. Of course, we know that there's a risk, that there's the same twofold risk. One of them is inflation, and one of them is overheated markets, because people go, I have all this money. It doesn't make sense to save it because more is coming in the future. So I want to invest it in something. And all of a sudden you have more investors and therefore higher investment value than something's worth. So you might, for example, have a stock market that seems to be doing shockingly well, even though the fundamentals of the economy don't make any sense. I'm just making that up. I don't know why I'd be saying that now, but I think you'd have a lot of economists at that point saying, if you're the United States today, and if you have an economy that has some underlying problems and roadblocks, and your stock market is still super hot, It's a sign that something's wrong. And they would say that the thing that is wrong is that credit and money are too easily available, right? Which seems a little counterproductive. More money is more good, but the money doesn't represent anything. It's just, you don't have more food. We don't have more roads, more steel, more labor. We just have more money to throw at the same stuff as we decide, as the market decides how it's going to get used. And that can cause a lot of bad signals. And those bad signals mean misinvestment. And that misinvestment means collapse. So,
in which many ways, that's why I keep going back to Spain, and the comparison seems so bright to me. And
yeah.
but they were also on the cutting edge, that this was all brand new to them, that, pretty much like you had said, the money supply in Europe had not changed in, I think, close to at least several hundred years, that there just was no new gold coming in, no new species coming in. And so then when all this gets flooded in, and then lending markets get opened up, they're on the new thing. It's like, hey, they're operating on the old style. More money is more better.
Yeah.
And it just makes me wonder, like, we're on the precipice now, and we only know how things have worked in the past. Who knows? I mean, I always, from what you had said, and that, when you were talking, that's really like how my mind's thinking, as somebody who's an armchair economist, like an armchair philosopher, historian,
movie critic.
Yeah, movie critic. It sure does seem like that's something to think about, is that, can the good times roll forever? Can they keep churning out electronic money that's just going to keep things floating? That endlessly fascinates me. That's another thing that makes me sit there and, just like spin my gears, and maybe if I knew more of something, of any one of those topics, I'd probably be able to come to a better conclusion. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
I mean, here's all I'll say is, what I know for certain is that there are people with, 20 years, like individuals with 20 years of hardcore economics education in this, who argue fiercely and endlessly with each other. And so what I will say is that no matter what we think about, what you and I think about, flooding the market with digital money, we'll find people who are super spooked by it, and we'll find people who want to do way more of it. We actually have an episode on Reconsider by Professor Larry Marsh of Notre Dame. And he said, we should be not just printing money, but we should be printing money and putting it directly, or we should be printing digital money and just putting it directly into people's bank accounts. And I'm like, that's crazy. It's fake money. It's going to cause inflation. And he, of course, I don't know how much I agree with him, but he's a real professor. He studied this for a long time. He's like, no, it's totally different from that. So certainly the difference between the Spanish and us today is that we are a little smarter. We do have professionals who at least think about how much money should we print. One of the things that was hard for the Spanish was that they'd get this gold, right? And then they would spend it to cut down their forests and then send all that wood to the bottom of the English Channel, right? So they got all this gold, and they ended up poorer for it because that gold wasn't invested in stuff. It actually took away core resources that then became much more expensive, and wood was hard to find, and all sorts of bad stuff happened. And so war is weird. I know after World War II, everyone decided war was good for the economy. I think because Keynes said so. But a lot of the things that are bad about war, even for the economy that's not getting the war treading over its soil, is what did the Americans do? We mined a bunch of steel and coal, or iron and coal. We built a bunch of steel. We paid people to do it. And we took that steel and sent it over in Europe and left it there, right? In forms of burnt out tanks and shells and stuff like that. And how much more wealthy could America have been? Like, was it good for the economy? Well, how much better would it have been for the economy if all that steel was built as buildings and roads and all sorts of stuff that was used here? Obviously better. And so that was, I think, that's the other factor to keep in mind, is that regardless of what your money's velocity and supply looks like, if you're able to invest it in stuff that provides real value going forward, lowers barriers to trade and commerce and work, et cetera, you can get benefit from it. And if you use that money to take precious natural resources and put them at the bottom of the English Channel, you're in trouble no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good thing to discuss too is just the role of empires in all of this, and how empires work. I guess what do you think about, you had the Spanish Empire and they're going up against England, which we think of England as an empire, would later turn into one, but it really wasn't quite an empire at that point. How do you think that all fit together with this Spanish Empire that was really quite highly fractured too in Europe? There
Yes.
was the Austrians and the Balkans was all jammed into there, and Netherlands. How can you get to hold all of that together in a practical sense?
Good question. That you actually, I'm really glad you brought this up because we do get to talk about one of England's core advantages throughout. That I think even led to its rise as the global empire, and it's taxation. So the English were incredibly efficient at gathering taxes from a very early period. In the 100 Years' War, which was between England and France, England had two major advantages over France. One, it had a system that was fairly centralized. People, like the king, was the lord of all the land. And this is actually because of William the Conqueror, who came in and said, I'm lord of all the land, and I basically grant it to nobles. And everyone was like, okay, you just kicked our butts. I guess it goes that way. This allowed England to have a lot of control over the nobles, have a lot of control over the land, and therefore taxation and money and people. Whereas France in the 100 Years' War was more like an empire. It was a bunch of French nobles, but the reason you hear about the Duke of Normandy and the Duke of Bourbon and Duke of Orleans and all those guys is because they had their own thing going on, and they were, arguably loyal to the king, but it wasn't the king's land, it was the duke's land. And so the dukes controlled this tax money, and the dukes could decide they didn't like the king and that they weren't going to help, and the king wasn't powerful enough to necessarily do anything about it if the other dukes didn't get on board. So what this meant was that England did have this massive advantage for not being an empire, for being just a unified state with a system that was very centralized. Spain had the massive disadvantage but the Habsburgs had this massive disadvantage, which again, their war with England was just a preview, going into this as this massive sprawling empire with all these different rules about, and like territories that we can't even fathom it today, but you go to a certain spot on a map and it is actually part of 3 different entities at once in different ways. Mm-hmm. And it really meant that Spain and the Habsburgs had a limited ability to extract wealth and resources and control these areas. And arguably they were money pits, many of them, especially the Balkans. And that meant that, we always talk about empires that get kind of too top heavy and then topple. The Habsburgs managed to hold on for a long time, but they were definitely.
Is there anything else from this movie that's brought up into your mind or that made you think a little bit more deeply about some certain topics?
I want to go back to history and geopolitics a little bit, because having now reminded myself that the 30 Years' War happens after all this, what we see in this history leading up to the 30 Years' War, of which England and Spain are a part, is a somewhat obvious, just plain old sectarian throwdown, right? Just like the Sunnis and the Shiites, right, have been doing it before and been doing it since. And so there's a clear sectarian portion to it. Pius V, right, was not only frustrated by England's participation in the Netherlands, but Protestantism was fairly new. It was gaining traction, and it was scary to this established order. Europe was not Europe before the 30 Years' War. It was Christendom, right? It was like being white and being European and being Christian were all the same thing. And as much as the Europeans fought, them being Christian, Catholic, united them against a common foe, the Ottomans, who almost took over Vienna and totally took over Spain and took over part of Italy. I mean, the Ottomans were scary stuff. They were super powerful and really good at their state building and warcraft. And so there's this, and so what we see kind of brewing here, I think going back to the beginning where I say, what's again missing from the movie, but I thought about more as I read about it. Spain and England breaking up, even though England was kind of Protestant. Even when by the time Philip married Mary, it was it was an Anglican or Church of England kind of place. The fact that their friendship turned so sour that they both made themselves broke fighting, I think was a sign of a growing realization in Europe that there was this risk of fracture and breakdown, much in the way the United States Civil War happened, right? Why did the Union fight with the South? It was actually to keep it together, right? It wasn't to just kick their butts. It was to keep the Union together. And a lot of what we see from Pius and probably from Philip of Spain is an attempt to stem the tide, keep this permanent rift from forming and preserve Christendom because the memory of Vienna is so fresh. And so we can almost see this as, instead of a war between states, a civil war within Christendom. It is one of the things I do like about the movie, is that as much as it's a little over the top about it's like, ooh, Catholics bad and like kind of creepy and weird thing, them choose, whoever wrote it, choosing to paint this as a part of a religious conflict in which the Pope is like kind of quietly from the background a major player, in which Philip's loyalty to the Pope and his religious convictions are a major driver. All of that emphasis, which again, it got some criticism for, I think has like this accuracy of flavor, if you would, that I think I did not expect. When I first saw the movie, I did not have as much appreciation for how much it leaned into the religious question and how pervasive that was. It felt like a massive oversimplification at the time. I think I have much more appreciation for it now. And I think with that appreciation of all the weird ways in which the Protestant Catholic divide led to the deaths of like so many people in Europe, the movie gives me this like ever deeper appreciation for Elizabeth and her ability to hold the state together through external and internal attempts to not only dethrone her, but upset the religious order of and I remember the name, Acts of Supremacy.